We are back, and we are joined now by Margaret MacMillan, professor of history at University of Toronto and author of War: How Conflict Shaped Us. Margaret, thank you so much for your time today and joining us on this program.
Pleasure to be here.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you because, I mean, your book is ambitious in scope, and it really, I mean, we spend so much time sanitizing, commemorating, and mythologizing war that analoging it, I mean, and studying its actual history and how it moves with and shapes our history, it almost takes a back seat. Why did you find that was the case in writing your book here?
I think we think about war, as you say, something mythological. We think about the great moments, we think about the great disasters. And I think what we need to do is also think about it as a very constant force, unfortunately, in human history, which has shaped our societies, our ideas, our worlds, our cultures. And so I think it's one of those great forces like geography or climate or economics. And I think we need to take it into account because it's played such an important part in human history.
And do you think that part of the reason that it's not taken into account is because when grappling with the violence of it, one has to actually think about the violence?
We have to confront that it's violent. Yeah. And I think we don't like to. And I think a lot of us live in very peaceable societies where we disapprove, rightly, of violence. And so there's a fear that if we study war too much, we might get enamored of it and enamored of and begin to love violence. And of course, war is about violence, but it's about much more. It's about organizing. It's an enormously organized institution. When you think of the money, the organization, the human beings, the material you need, it's helped to build our bureaucracies and our strong central governments.
Right. I mean, one of the things that you wrote about, which I thought was like really interesting, and we're a leftist show, so we're often speaking about war, and we appreciate anti-war movements, but you also see how war sometimes elevates labor and elevates wages because the demand is so necessary, and the organization of society is so needed in a wartime effort. Particularly, I think about, of course, World War II and the way the United States responded, and women entering the workforce, for example.
I think it's one of the paradoxes, and there are many paradoxes about war. I mean, we're simultaneously attracted and repelled by it. But the great paradox is that it can sometimes bring beneficial results. And we wouldn't choose to do it that way, and we should be doing it in other ways. But sometimes a great catastrophe makes us treat our less fortunate members of society better. It helps to level the playing field between the very rich and the poor. It makes for more equal societies. It's helped to promote war. The Second World War, as you said, helped to promote women's rights. It's a bit like the COVID pandemic. It has brought about great changes in society, which may in the end be beneficial for us, but we wouldn't do it in that way if we could do it some other way.
And I mean, maybe this is a bit philosophical, but like, why are we unable to galvanize our society without these great, bloody, and horrific catastrophes?
I guess it's partly human nature. You know, if things are going along fairly smoothly, we get on with our lives and we think about our lives, and that's as it should be. But sometimes we need to think, and politicians need to think, in the long future. We need to think what's going to happen in the next 10 years, the next 20 years. I mean, I think climate change is another example of this. You know, we are going to have to start thinking collectively as a human species about how we deal with climate change. And we're not very good at thinking out ahead, especially, as I say, if times are going fairly well.
Right. I guess we can back up then and talk about this and historicize war as a concept. We can go as far back in the Roman Empire, which you write about, and then also, I guess, take it up to the French Revolution, in order to historicize it, and then we can modernize our conversation. But let's back up then to the Roman Empire and the way that it approached war.
Yeah. And I think you've touched on something very important, is that different societies fight different sorts of war because they're different and their goals are different and the structure of their societies is different. So in Roman society, the Romans were very, very efficient at fighting, but only those who were free men fought. Slaves didn't fight, and there were a great many slaves in the Roman Empire. And it was considered an honorable calling, and it was something that young men were expected often to do. They were expected to do military service. What happened with the French Revolution was that we got a very different notion of what it meant to belong to a society and belong to a state. And that was we became citizens. The Romans, of course, were citizens too if they were free, but we forgot about that for a long time. But with the French Revolution, we remembered again that people were citizens, men, of course, in those days it was men, but it eventually became women too. And when you're a citizen, you have an obligation to defend your state because it belongs to you. And so we get a very new relationship, I think, developing as a result of the French Revolution and other changes between people and their governments.
Does that connect the concept of citizenry to nationalism? Because, I mean, in the United States, constantly it's only tax-paying citizens, taxpayers. The history of the concept of tax-paying is a separate, racialized history in the U.S. But even, I mean, when you're dividing up citizens versus non-citizens, it creates tribal instincts that might cause new dynamics with war.
Unfortunately, I think citizenship does, but not always, but it can go along with a sort of nationalism, often an ethnic nationalism, where we all belong to the same family because we speak the same language or have the same religion. And the United States, as a great country with many different religions and many different ethnicities within it, I think has avoided some of that nationalism. But certainly you do get a connection between nationalism and war. I mean, if you think your nation is the best one, or if you think it's threatened, then you are going to want to defend it, and you're going to want to fight for it. And so the connection between nationalism and war is often quite a close one.
And what were some of the differences that you were able to trace with, say, traditional Western or European approaches to war? I mean, I would imagine colonialism plays a significant role. But even prior to that, the way even European nomadic people fought or settled societies in Europe versus, say, other continents throughout the globe?
Well, you fight with what you have. And if you have weapons that aren't very good or very strong, like bronze weapons, you're careful about how you use them because you know they can break in your hands. And once you get stronger iron weapons, then you can be a bit more daring. And the horse makes a huge difference because men on horseback, and again, it was mainly men, can sweep over and attack people on the ground. They're much more mobile. And so depending on what's available, that affects how you fight. But you had then, of course, what societies do is learn how to respond to that. And so eventually the horse was dealt with by foot soldiers who stood firm, and the development of better arrows, for example, and bows that could fire further away, and eventually, of course, the development of gunpowder. So whatever is available to society will affect the way it fights. But so too will the nature of societies. If you have a very hierarchical society where only the aristocrats at the top, for example, are able to own property and do certain things, they will tend to have those people fight as well. They don't want ordinary people fighting because they might learn how to use it against their own rulers.
Right. And so I guess we can talk a little bit about we can move to the French Revolution, where I think there's a lot of the pivot points that you point to. How did things shift then? Because my understanding, and from what I've read, monarchs in Europe before that time tended to rely on a hodgepodge of fighters, often mercenaries, and then this really shifted after the French Revolution in Europe. Tell us a little bit about that shift and why that cemented certain institutions.
Sure. Well, in Europe before the French Revolution, and the American Revolution is very important here as well, because it's an example, and a lot of Europeans pay attention to it. But in the 18th century and before, the people who were the officers tended to come from the upper classes because that was just expected what you did if you were a young man from the upper classes. And otherwise, you used as ordinary soldiers people you didn't want for anything else. And so you wouldn't take a good farmer and make him into a soldier because that person would be much better off farming and producing food for everyone else. In England, in the 18th century, if you were sent to jail, if you were going to be executed, for example, you were often given a choice of going to jail or being executed or joining the army, which tells you something about the sort of treatment and the expectations of ordinary soldiers. But the American Revolution and the French Revolution set in motion this idea that people are not subjects, they're citizens. In other words, they have a share in their own government, they help to choose their own government, and correspondingly they want to try and defend it. And the other thing that happened in the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution, which may have started in Europe but rapidly spread around the world. And it made it possible to move people much larger numbers using things like railways and steamships, and then eventually the internal combustion engine and airplanes. And it made it possible to produce huge amounts of weapons, huge amounts of uniforms. It made it possible to have much bigger wars. And so you had motivation for war increasing with I think, nationalism and this notion that we're citizens and have to defend our own government and our own society. It's also possible to have much bigger wars, which is why the First and Second World Wars were so massive in scale.
And how did that correspond with Napoleon's rise in particular?
Napoleon was just at the beginning of this change, and he benefited from the newly awakened sense of French nationalism. And his soldiers felt they were fighting for a cause. They felt they were fighting for France, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. And they also saw themselves as missionaries. They were going to spread these ideas around Europe. And when they began to spread them, of course, they created opposition, and people said, well, actually, we're not French, but we have our own views. And so in a funny way, the French, by wanting to spread their ideas, actually increased nationalism among other people, which was often turned on them. But Napoleon was still fighting in the old way. He was in charge before modern technology had begun to make a huge difference. And so his soldiers had to march. And one of his real problems always was feeding them and keeping them supplied, which is why when he invaded Russia in 1812 with a massive army, he couldn't feed that army. And a lot of the soldiers who went with Napoleon to Russia died of starvation, not because the Russians killed them, although, of course, a lot of them were killed in fighting too. So if Napoleon had commanded modern armies, say, in the 20th century, he would have been, I think, a very formidable commander indeed.
So kind of ahead of his time in that era. I mean, not to laud it, of course, but just in looking at it in a dispassionate way. And then probably spurring a lot of technological innovations with war as his influence crept across Europe, and wars of nationalism became a bit more normalized.
Yeah, well, war has always spurred technological innovation, because if you can get an edge on the enemy with a better weapon, with, say, a better type of metal, or a stronger bow that can fire further, or, of course, guns that are more efficient and fire further, then you have a real advantage. And so often countries have invested in technology for war, and in wartime that is often sped up. I mean, I think the development of airplanes, for example, and then the development of the jet engine was very much speeded up. It was probably going to happen anyway, but very much speeded up by war. And often governments and societies will spend money in war on investments in technology and science which they wouldn't spend in peacetime. You know, the example I often use is penicillin, which has saved literally millions of lives since it first began to be put into production. It was discovered how to make it at the end of the 1920s, but everyone thought it was too expensive. When the Second World War came, suddenly it wasn't too expensive. And I think we're seeing the same thing with the reaction to the COVID pandemic. What would have been too expensive before the pandemic started, the research, the production of the vaccines,
right,
became important.
Yes. And I mean, I guess to stay with Europe in that time, I mean, if we're moving to the UK, the East India Company, the usage of militarism in order to maintain global capitalism. How did that fit into war as influencing and spurring certain innovations and certain social structures?
Well, imperialism and colonialism, the settlement of peoples from Europe and elsewhere around the world, were really enabled by the dominance that European societies, and that includes, in fact, the United States, which very much benefited from this, the dominance they had in technology. And it wasn't a dominance that was going to last for long. It was a very brief period. I mean, before the beginning of the 19th century, China was probably as strong or stronger than most European countries. Japan was probably as strong or stronger. The Ottoman Empire was strong or stronger. But what happened in the course of the 19th century was that European countries, Western countries, developed this technological edge. And so they had better weapons when they went out to deal with the sorts of people they were trying to take over. It was a very, very unfair battle, very unfair advantage. And eventually, of course, what was going to happen is knowledge of the technology and ways of using it was going to spread. But it certainly is true that a lot of Western empires, and the expansion of the United States as well, were a result of war, or depended on the war-making capacity of the powers that were carrying out this expansion.
And we've modernized that technological innovation in the form of what we colloquially call the military-industrial complex, because I mean, still military technologies in the United States will ramp up, even though the money is constantly there, but will ramp up, and those industries will accumulate a lot of capital and growth during times of war.
Yeah, and it's something that President Eisenhower warned about in one of his last speeches. You know, he said it can be dangerous. And I think what he was implying was it could, you know, every country needs to defend itself and should have defense industries, but it can be dangerous if the defense industries are too powerful and influence government in things like procurement. I mean, sometimes you get very effective lobbyists who say to governments, you know, you must have this latest airplane or this latest weapon. Governments may not need it. And I think it's dangerous because sometimes huge amounts of money are spent on things which may not necessarily be in the best interests of the country. So I think Eisenhower was right there that you have to really look critically at what it is you're trying to do and what sort of weapons you need, and not let the money, you know, not let those be determined by the companies that are going to make money out of it. On the other hand, the investment in military things has often had big benefits for civilian society. I mean, a lot of the early investment which made the internet possible was done for military reasons, defense reasons, but of course it helped to spawn Silicon Valley and the world in which we now live.
And then Silicon Valley has become in and of itself its own danger. But I mean, I think that's sometimes just the nature of capitalism, and there's a way too that this can feed upon itself. If the money making machine becomes so lucrative, then wartime can be more tantalizing for governments when there's an understanding that money can be had. Especially, I mean, we see this. I thought the Iraq War was a significant example of that.
And I don't think governments go to war because they think they've got all this weaponry. I mean, I've never felt that an arms race or the development of arms creates war. But if you believe that you have tremendous power and you believe you have an edge over all your opponents, you tend to think you can sort everything out. And I think one of the traps that the British fell into when they had their big empire, and I think the Americans perhaps have fallen into it a bit as well, certainly in Iraq, was thinking that because our power is so overwhelming, everyone else is going to recognize it. You know, these people will be fighting with much inferior weapons to ours. Same thing's true in Afghanistan. I mean, the weapons, for the most part, that the Taliban and the other groups in Afghanistan are using are not terribly sophisticated, but they're using them very skillfully and they know the country and they can hide in it. And so I think the danger for advanced technological societies is to think technology can do everything. And I think we're realizing it can do an awful lot, but it can't do everything.
We are covering today just the fact that the Kabul drone strike executed by the Biden administration was, you know, the technology so precise, you're able to locate the exact terrorist at this exact point. And of course, the Pentagon is admitting that 10 civilians were killed, including 7 children. And that's, you know, when you fall back on technology and you fetishize it to a way, then you fall into these traps.
Yes, and I think technology, you know, I'm always worried when people say we can pinpoint exactly where we're going to drop a bomb or use a drone, because one of the things we know for sure that happen in war is mistakes and accidents, and things don't always turn out the way you expect them to. And I think to rely too much on technology, I mean, of course you have to rely on technology in war, that's part of war making, but to rely on it to solve all your problems and to assume that it's always going to work correctly, I think is a big step, and I think you should really, really be careful.
So I wanted to back up a little bit because, you know, we were talking about the 1800s, we were talking about Napoleon in this time period, and the Civil War was the bloodiest war in the United States history. I mean, what did that do for U.S. society and how it categorized it, besides the obvious divisions between North and South? But in terms of the innovation and the tech that you describe, especially relative to the way society became organized in regards to Native Americans and indigenous people?
Well, I think what the Civil War did is show just how important railways were and how important it was to have a strong industrial base. And one of the things that really told in favor of the North was that they had an advantage in both those areas. And the South, which had probably, I mean, many will disagree with them, but I think the South probably had better generals. Certainly in Robert E. Lee, they had an amazing general, but they didn't have that base and they didn't have the capacity to move their troops around in the same way. And I don't need to tell you or any Americans about the divisions that the Civil War has left in American society. I mean, you're still arguing about it, and I suspect you'll go on arguing about it. But what the Civil War did, I think, in terms of American attitudes was, I think it enhanced the value of military force, that military force could be used to settle a lot of things. And of course, after the Civil War was over, there was this tremendous expansion westwards, which brought the rest of the continental United States under the into the American Federation. And that was an expansion that was marked by wars, often very violent wars, and by a great deal of violence. A number of cases, the indigenous Americans fought back. I mean, they had acquired by this point weapons which they were able to use, and they also had some very good military commanders, but they were simply overwhelmed by a much larger society that kept on pressing into their lands.
Right. I was also fascinated a little as well by some of the ways in which popular armies shape societies in this time period that you wrote about that I would never have thought of, including instilling values of, I guess, kind of militarism or even racism or misogynistic attitudes in young men in some of these societies because of the way that we chose to construct armies going forward.
Well, sometimes it's not even a choice. Sometimes it's just something that happens. It's to do with the nature of society. And you had, certainly in Europe before the First World War, I think you had it less in the US, but even kind of, certainly in North America and Canada, my own country, in the US, in this period, so towards the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, you did get in societies an admiration for the military, a feeling that the military was somehow nobler and better than the rest of us. They were the ones, after all, who were prepared to sacrifice their lives and defend the rest of us. And it's, you understand that admiration, but it's dangerous when it gets to the point that when people say we mustn't question the military because they are the key part of the nation. And that certainly happened in Germany and a few other countries. And that was dangerous because it let the military think they could make up their own minds and they didn't have to pay attention to the civilians. But what also was happening, and this was part of the militarism, was that a number of societies' military values, as you pointed out, were filtering out into society. When I look at pictures of school classes in Europe, particularly before the First World War, school children are wearing uniforms. They all look like little soldiers or little sailors. And that, I think, is an indication of the way in which military values were admired. Even things like the Boy Scouts were set up initially to instill military values, discipline, serving your country, and so on, learning how to read maps, learning how to read compasses. They were set up to make the boys and later on the girls who joined them good little soldiers, or in the case of the girls, good nurses, good supports for wars. So I think that can be a bad thing when societies get infiltrated, if you like, with too many military values. It's not that they're bad values, but there are other values that are important too.
It's fascinating. And we've talked about this on the show too, specifically in the Donald Trump era when he was so chaotic and crazy. And there were some people who were, looking to military leadership or saying, oh, look at this military leader critiquing Donald Trump. They are above the perils and the pitfalls of the elected representatives who are crazy or whatever. And while we were in agreement about Trump's threats, that tendency is troubling because you can see it internationally. That's how military leadership ends up resulting in coups.
Well, I think it's interesting. In the United States, I believe that polls show that the military are among the most admired, perhaps the most admired people in American society. Politicians come way down, and I hate to tell you, journalists don't come much higher. Sorry about that, as far as I know in the polls, and I'm not sure academics are any better, so I can't take any pleasure in that. And I can understand why people admire the military, but I agree with you that it shouldn't be something that societies sort of resort to. At least we've got a good military. I think we need to deal with all our problems, and we can't count on the military to solve them. And I thought what was worrying in the Trump period was the way in which he tried to involve the military in his own political machinations. I mean, that famous march to the church in Washington, where he dragged the chief of the Joint Staff, the Joint Chief of Staff, with him. That I think was bad for the military, and I think a lot of military actually came to think so. And I think it was also, it's not a good sign when you get former military, a lot of them very distinguished and a very high rank, doing what the military usually don't do and expressing their worry about the government. Not a good sign. I can understand why they're worried, and I think they were right to express it, but you don't want that happening in a society.
I'm wondering if we could just take a quick turn to talk a little bit about the history of the anti-war movement relative to the way that modern warfare came to be. in your research, what did you find about the burgeoning anti-war movement when it ebbed and when it flowed, and how that fit into some of the different wars throughout history?
I think we've always had anti-war movements. I mean, they've taken different forms in different eras and different societies, but I think in many cultures around the world, there've always been those who said war is a very wasteful and, in the end, very dangerous way of settling our disputes. There must be other ways of doing it. You know, there's a strong tradition in traditional Chinese society, for example, that statesmanship and dealing with those who might be your enemies is much the better way than making war on them. And I think this is something that most societies have grappled with. Also, how do you try and protect the innocent? How do you try and protect the civilians who really have no part in war, yet get caught up in it? Or how do you protect those who are made prisoner? I mean, these are things that societies have thought about for a very long time. Or how do you try and get rid of war altogether? I mean, the ancient Greeks had a practice of not fighting on certain religious holidays, not fighting during the Olympics. The medieval church in Europe tried to bring in something similar where it said there should be no fighting on days like Christmas or Easter. And so we've had repeated attempts trying to limit war and actually trying to get rid of it. I think often anti-war movements tend to grow in strength just after a war, or when there's been a war scare. And so during the Cold War, for example, you know, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, I think we all began to think we really need to, you know, get engaged and do something about this because we might all be blown sky high. And so I think how strongly we feel about trying to deal with war depends very much on our societies, but it depends on what we've just gone through. I mean, after the First World War, anti-war movements were very strong, and there was a tremendous support for the League of Nations, which was meant to make war impossible. And same thing after the Second World War.
Right. And of course we had maybe the United States at the height of its power coming out of the Second World War and its air of legitimacy, and then we moved to Vietnam, and then of course the Gulf War and the Iraq War, which three wars that I mean are indefensible in my opinion, and then, of course, I think we're at a very precarious state for the American empire precisely because of those wars.
Well, one of the things about being a great power is you have to persuade other people you're a great power. You know, you can do counting. You can count how many guns you have and how many aircraft you have and how many ships you have and so on. But there is also this sort of rather difficult thing to measure, and that is credibility and how much are other people going to believe in you. Now, I don't think everything the United States did since the end of the Second World War contributed to a perception of the United States as weak. I mean, the United States fought very successfully in Korea, and I think that is something that, you know, Americans can remember. And in Vietnam, in a curious way, I would argue, as others have done, that the United States actually won the war on the ground, but that wasn't the point. It lost it in public opinion. And in the end, Americans at home said, you know, what is this about? And it's not worth fighting. And so I think the United States still has credibility as a military power, but you're absolutely right that the experience, not the first Gulf War, I mean, when Saddam Hussein was evicted from Kuwait, I mean, that was, I think, a very striking American victory, and one which the Americans wisely, in my view, stopped when they had achieved their goal of getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. They didn't try and overthrow his regime. The second intervention, of course, the invasion and occupation of Iraq at the beginning of the 2000s, I think did end badly. And I think left a lot of Americans wondering what they had been there for. And Iraq doesn't seem to be any better off. And indeed, it's worse off than it perhaps it was when the Americans intervened. And I think the same thing is true of Afghanistan. But that doesn't mean that the United States is fatally weakened. It remains a very big military power. And I think what will be important in the next years is what the United States and its military and its political leaders and its people learn from the Iraq invasion and occupation, learn from Afghanistan, and how they use their very considerable power. I mean, I think it's going to be a time, I hope, of considerable sort of studying and reflection for Americans. What can we learn from this, and what do we do as we look into the future?
Well, because I think when we're framing, you know, who won and who didn't, we're like the context of, say, if we're talking about Vietnam, the My Lai massacre, or the way that children are inextricably what's the word I'm looking for? Basically disfigured, and there are all of these horrors that are associated with it. In the Gulf War, we destroyed nearly 90% of Iraq's water infrastructure. Like, I think some of that context of warfare is lost when we're looking at it from a 30,000-foot view.
I think that can be dangerous. And I think, Americans have lost their lives in Afghanistan and Iraq, but we need to remember that far more Iraqis and Afghanis have been killed in the years of fighting there. And I think, we have to, as societies, and, Canada was not involved in the invasion and occupation of Iraq, but we were involved in Afghanistan. We have to, as societies, look at what we did there. I think we have to face what went wrong, what we might have done differently. I agree with you that we have to understand the costs of the war and not turn our backs on them. I mean, the temptation always, particularly I think after war ends, is just to get on with life and forget about it and not talk about it very much. And I notice even now the coverage of what's going on in Afghanistan and Iraq is much, much less than it would have been, immediately after the troops were pulled out.
Well, it was curious too how we talked about it at length. The coverage of our Afghanistan withdrawal was so histrionic and, what are we doing, as opposed to the fuller context of the 19 years previously in which the United States was not able to gain footing in Afghanistan in any meaningful way.
Well, there'll be many people, it's already started, of course, looking at what went right and what went wrong in Afghanistan. And one argument, which I think, needs to be examined, is if the NATO allies, led, of course, by the United States, which was the largest contributor in Afghanistan, but if the NATO allies had resolved to put into Afghanistan some of the resources that were later put elsewhere. I mean, the United States did put troops into Afghanistan, did put resources into Afghanistan, but it was almost immediately distracted by the invasion and occupation of Iraq. It is possible that things might have turned out differently in Afghanistan. That if there had been a sustained nation-building effort, as it was hit and miss. The goals kept changing. I remember hearing a Canadian diplomat talk, and he listed about 10 different goals of why Canada was in Afghanistan, and they kept changing. And they started out to get rid of the Taliban and deal with Al-Qaeda, and then it became building an infrastructure, then it became building a modern economy, then it became women's rights, all of which were good aims. But it seems to me there was really lack of any clarity among those who were responsible for Afghanistan, the governments back home, what it is we were doing there and what sort of resources we'd need. And I think we need to look at that, because if we get involved, and we from the West or powerful countries get involved again in countries with failing states or states that collapse, then we really need to know what we're doing.
Lastly, I just wanted to touch on the concept of getting good at war as society evolves and how we've kind of practiced it. And now, I mean, I don't know if it's possible to get good at war, but I mean, that's kind of seemed to be the aim throughout history. We take steps and we try to innovate and make things cleaner. But as I mentioned with the example earlier, it's impossible to do so. So I guess to wrap things up, talk a little bit about that idea.
War is very organized, and I think in many societies we've become better at it as we've become more organized. And often there's an argument actually that the more you make war, the more organized you get as a society. It's very difficult to know which comes first, chicken or egg. But I think when you look at how organized modern armies are compared, say, to armies in the past, the sheer amount of organizational detail and planning that has to go on, I think we have become good at it. But what always matters is whether or not a people or a nation want to fight. And I think what's really interesting is how you've had real shifts over time. The Swedish soldiers and Swedish armies used to be the terror of Europe up until the end of the 18th century. And now think of Sweden today. It's seen as a country which sponsors peace and sponsors peace initiatives. And that's very true. Germany, which was one of the most militaristic countries in Europe before 1945, it's hard today to imagine Germany starting a world war again. It's just become a very different society. And so I think we change. And so making war, we may get the organizational side better, but we may not want to do it. And I think that in a way is a good thing, except we always run into the problem of what do we do if someone attacks us and when we have to defend ourselves. And then we may find ourselves changing our attitudes towards war. Very difficult to predict, I think, how we will react until it actually happens.
Margaret MacMillan, Professor of History at University of Toronto and Professor Emeritus, I should say, at Oxford University as well, author of War, How Conflict Shaped Us. Margaret, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.